Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place beyond the stars where nightmares live, and they have names. They are old, beyond any calendar kept by mortal hands. They are vast, beyond any measurement that human mathematics can honestly describe. They have consumed civilizations the way a candle consumes itself. From the inside out, slowly, with an almost gentle inevitability. Four gods of ruin and madness sit coiled at the heart of a dimension that runs parallel to every moment of your existence, feeding on the emotions you feel when you wake in the dark and cannot remember why you are afraid, feeding on the rage that pulls your hands into fists without warning, feeding on every hunger you have ever carried and every moment of doubt that has ever made you feel like you might simply come apart at the seams. These are the Chaos Gods of Warhammer 40,000, Khorne, Nurgle, Dbsench, Slaanesh, the Ruinous Powers, the Dark Gods, the four ancient hungers that sit at the center of the warp and look out at a galaxy of trembling, feeling, suffering souls and see only food. And for most of the people who walk through the lore of this universe, for most of the soldiers and scholars and broken saints who populate the grim darkness of the far future, the Chaos Gods represent something absolutely and completely beyond opposition. They are the ceiling of power in this setting, the final predators, the thing that lives above everything else on the food chain, looking down at every other horror in the galaxy with something that would be boredom if boredom could kill. When guardsmen throw themselves into the grinder at the edge of a warp rift, when space marines pray over the bodies of their fallen brothers, as when entire planetary populations are consumed by demonic incursion, and every psyker within 100 light-years screams in unison as the voices from beyond flood their undefended minds, the Chaos Gods are not threatened by any of this. They are fed by it. They grow stronger with every act of violence, every wave of despair, every sensation of agony or ecstasy that ripples through the mortal universe and bleeds upward into the Imperium. So the question this video asks is the kind that sounds simple until you really sit with it. What, in all of the vast and ancient lore of Warhammer 40,000, has ever actually made the Chaos Gods afraid? Not inconvenienced, not temporarily repelled, not annoyed by the buzzing resistance of some stubborn mortal species that refuses to lie down and die. Genuinely, cosmically, existentially afraid. Was the kind of afraid where even beings that are literally made of psychic energy and ancient malevolent purpose look at something and feel the cold weight of a threat they cannot simply consume and grow stronger from. Because it has happened. It happens more than you might think. And the answers, when you start pulling the threads, reveal something truly extraordinary about the architecture of this setting, that the Chaos Gods, for all their incomprehensible power, are not invulnerable. They are not eternal in the sense that nothing can ever genuinely threaten them. They exist in a very specific way. They need a very specific kind of universe to keep existing, and when certain forces arise that threaten to deny them that universe, or worse, is to simply wipe the slate of consciousness clean so that no emotions can ever feed them again. They respond with something very close to what, in a lesser being, you would simply call panic. Think about what it takes to genuinely frighten a god. Not a mortal god, not the limited divine being of some planetary religion, but a god in the Warhammer sense. A being so vast and old and deeply rooted in the fundamental structure of a psychic dimension that its mere existence shapes reality. The Chaos Gods have watched empires rise and fall. They have consumed civilizations so thoroughly that even the memory of those civilizations was ground to nothing. They have spent tens of millions of years playing a game against each other that makes every military campaign fought by mortal species look like children pushing wooden soldiers around a map. And they have taken everything the galaxy has thrown at them and grown stronger for it, for something to threaten these beings at a level that registers as genuine existential fear rather than tactical inconvenience. It has to attack the foundations of what they are. Not their armies, not their demons, not even their champions. The foundations, the specific conditions that allow them to exist at all. This is a story about those forces, about the things that exist in the 41st millennium and before it that have genuinely, law-verifiably given the gods of chaos reason to fear. The things that made Khorne's skull throne rattle on its foundations, that made Tzeentch's schemes fold back on themselves in consternation, that made Nurgle's garden grow cold and quiet in ways it never should. That made Slaanesh's insatiable hunger falter for just a breath in the face of something it could not simply eat. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine the warp as these beings experience it, not as the swirling hell dimension that Space Marine veterans try very hard not to look too closely at, but as something alive, warm, endlessly churning with the psychic output of every thinking being in the galaxy. To the Chaos Gods, the warp is their ocean, their home, their food supply, and their kingdom all at once. They cannot imagine existing outside of it. They cannot conceive of a universe where the emotional turbulence that created them simply stops. Now imagine what it would feel like to sense something in that ocean that is cold. Not cold the way winter is cold, which is a kind of energy of its own, but cold the way a dead star is cold. Cold the way absence is cold. Cold the way something that consumes everything and leaves behind absolute nothing is cold. Cold the way the end of all things made real. That is the first thing on our list. But to appreciate why it frightens the dark gods so profoundly, you first need to understand exactly how those gods came to be, what they need to survive, and why almost nothing in the universe should theoretically be capable of threatening them at all. Pull up something comfortable, breathe slowly. We are going a long way back before we come forward. Part 1. Understanding the Chaos Gods. Power built on the bones of every feeling that has ever existed. Let us start at the very beginning of how the ruinous powers actually work. As because it is genuinely important for understanding their vulnerabilities. And it is also, on its own, one of the most quietly horrifying ideas in all of Warhammer's lore. That the things threatening to destroy the galaxy were created by the galaxy itself, out of the living material of every mind that has ever experienced something too large to contain. The Chaos Gods are not beings who existed first and then came to rule the warp. It is very nearly the opposite of that. They are the product of the warp responding to the emotional output of sentient life in the material universe over millions of years of accumulated pressure. Every feeling you have ever had, every moment of joy and grief and hunger and longing and rage, does not simply exist and then vanish. In the Warhammer universe, emotion is a form of psychic energy, and psychic energy leaves a mark in the Imperium, the dimension of pure psychic force that runs parallel to reality like a vast and turbulent mirror sea. Strong emotions, widespread emotions, ancient patterns of feeling repeated across billions of minds over millennia. These accumulate in the warp. They pool together. They coalesce into structures, into shapes, into things with enough coherent energy to begin developing something like intent. This process is not quick. It does not happen across years or centuries or even millennia in most cases. It happens across the kind of timescales where the rise and fall of entire interstellar civilizations is barely a beat in the rhythm of a larger change. But the warp is timeless in a way that the mortal universe is not, and the psychic energy that pours into it from the material realm has been accumulating since the first sentient beings in the galaxy began killing each other and mourning their dead, and dreaming of better lives they would never quite manage to live. Over those vast eons, the constant pressure of sentient suffering and passion and desire from the mortal races of the galaxy compressed into 4 massive knots of psychic energy, each one organized around a particular emotional archetype that had grown dominant enough and coherent enough to take on its own identity. 4 great currents of feeling, ancient enough and powerful enough to have developed something that functions as self-awareness. Khorne came from the violence. Not just simple physical violence, as though there has been an almost incomprehensible amount of that across the galaxy's history. Khorne crystallized from the full spectrum of martial experience. the pure physical joy of combat, the honor of the warrior's code, the animal satisfaction of strength proving itself, the red tide of battle rage, the grinding weight of hatred, the terrible glory of mass slaughter, at a scale where individual deaths stop being deaths and become a kind of dark music. Every soldier who ever went to war and found something in themselves that frightened them, every civilization that built its greatness on conquest and then could not stop, every species that discovered it could not put down what violence had made of it. All of this fed corn, shaped corn, eventually became corn. The blood god did not invent war. War invented him. The Nurgle came from the fear, specifically from one kind of fear that is older and deeper than any other, the fear of death, the fear of disease, the organic horror that every living thing carries at the base of its consciousness, the visceral recoiling from corruption and decay, and the knowledge that the body is temporary. But Nurgle is not simply death. He is death, plus the thing that refuses to die, the stubborn pulse of life that continues even in the presence of everything that should extinguish it. He is the plague that kills 3/4 of a population and the strange, fierce vitality of the quarter that survives. He is the rotting log that is also the richest soil in the forest. He is what you feel when you accept your own mortality, not with grace, but with a grim, unwashed, but deeply physical stubbornness that keeps the heart beating long past the point where it should have stopped. His is arguably the most universal of the 4 domains, because everything that lives eventually encounters his territory, whether it chooses to or not. Tzeentch came from the scheming, from the restless intelligence that cannot accept the world as it is and constantly works to reshape it into something different. He crystallized from every act of magic and manipulation, and political intrigue and desperate planning, from every mind that saw a pattern where others saw only noise, from every species that discovered language and immediately began using it to deceive. He is the god of hope as much as the god of scheming, which is perhaps the cruelest trick in a setting built on cruelty. Hope feeds Tzeentch because hope requires the imagination of a different future, and the imagination of a different future is precisely the psychic act that his domain feeds on. He is simultaneously all plans, and the thing that makes all plans fail, both the architect and the fundamental unpredictability that undermines every architecture. And then Slaanesh, the youngest, the one whose birth was a specific event rather than a gradual accumulation, whose creation could be pointed to on a timeline and given a name and a date. The Eldar were one of the Old One's greatest creations, a species of extraordinary psychic sensitivity and cultural refinement, and for millions of years they were the dominant intelligent species in the galaxy. Yes, their civilization was vast and old, and in many ways genuinely beautiful. Their arts, their philosophy, their understanding of the warp, their ability to walk the razor edge between the spiritual and the physical, these were achievements that no species before or since has matched. And then they fell. Not from military defeat or natural disaster. They fell inward, consumed by the excesses their own sophistication had made possible, spiraling into indulgences that would have horrified their ancestors, building an entire civilization around the pursuit of sensations so extreme that the line between experience and atrocity became invisible to them. For millions of years, the collective psychic weight of Eldari excess poured into the warp. Every act of cruelty committed in the name of pleasure, every sensation hunted to its most extreme and destructive form, every individual soul pursuing the absolute limit of what could be felt. And in the warp, that energy was building into something. When Slaanesh was finally born, the birth cry ripped the Eye of Terror open in the heart of Eldari space. The Prince of Pleasure consumed most of the Eldari gods in a single moment of divine appetite, devoured billions of Eldari souls in the same breath, and began its eternal hunt for the remainder with a hunger that 10,000 years have not dimmed. Understanding this origin, understanding that the Chaos gods are literally made of the most extreme expressions of sentient experience, is the foundation for understanding what they need to survive and what threatens them. They are not merely powerful beings who happen to live in the warp, as they are the warp in its most concentrated and purposeful form. They are what the warp becomes when enough emotion accumulates around a single archetype for long enough. And this means that anything which threatens the supply of that emotional energy, or which threatens the warp itself as a dimension, or which creates a being powerful enough to challenge them in their own domain, all of these things represent threats at the most fundamental possible level. The Chaos Gods do not simply need to win battles to stay alive. They need the galaxy to keep feeling things. They need sentient beings to keep being born and suffering and desiring and dying in ways that generate the specific psychic frequencies that sustain them. This is a dependency as fundamental and as vulnerable as any biological organism's dependency on food and oxygen. And the things on this list, the forces that have genuinely made the Chaos Gods afraid, all attack that dependency in one way or another. Let us go through them one by one. Part 2. The Emperor of Mankind, the Anathema on the Golden Throne. There is a word the demons of the warp use for the Emperor of Mankind. They do not call him the God Emperor, though that is what billions of humans name him. They do not call him the Master of Mankind, or the Corpse on the Throne, or any of the other epithets that get thrown around in the course of 10,000 years of theological debate. The word they use most consistently, the word that appears in account after account across the lore, is simply this: the anathema. An anathema is not simply an enemy. An anathema is something that is fundamentally, constitutionally, just structurally opposed to the existence of the thing that calls it by that name. Not a weapon that can hurt you, but a principle that negates what you are. The Chaos Gods call the Emperor the anathema, not out of hatred, though there is plenty of that, but out of a recognition that he represents the specific thing they cannot simply destroy and grow stronger from. The thing that is not food to them, but poison. Not fuel, but the absence of fire. To understand why, you need to understand where the Emperor came from. Long before the Great Crusade, long before the Horus Heresy, long before even the founding of the Imperium, there were the shamans, thousands of them, scattered across the ancient earth in the deep prehistory of humanity, which at a time when the species was still a young and largely unremarkable addition to the Old One's garden of created life. These were the first true psychers of humanity, men and women who had developed a genuine and controllable connection to the immaterium, who could feel the currents of psychic energy moving beneath the surface of the visible world and channel them in limited ways for the benefit of their communities. For centuries, and then millennia, these shamans held a unique and essential role in human society. They were the bridges between the material world and the spiritual dimension, the interpreters of the warp's patterns, the weavers of protections against the things that lurked in the dark places of the immaterium. And through their long cycles of reincarnation, dying, spending time in the warp, and accumulating more psychic power and experience, being born again into new bodies, they slowly became more than they had been. Each lifetime added to the depth of their connection to the spiritual dimension. Each rebirth strengthened the soul slightly, until the most ancient of them carried within them the condensed spiritual experience of hundreds of generations. But the warp was changing around them. As humanity grew more numerous, as human civilization became more complex, and human emotional life became richer and darker, as wars and empires and the full spectrum of organized human suffering began to develop, the psychic signature of the species became something that the entities of the warp could not ignore. The things that lived in the immaterium, the proto-demons and predatory psychic creatures, and the early, still forming currents that would eventually become the Chaos Gods. They noticed the shamans. They began to hunt them. What had once been a manageable spiritual practice became a gauntlet, and the shamans who had once been able to navigate the warp's currents with relative safety found themselves prey in a way they had not been before. The shamans saw what was coming. They could read the warp's patterns well enough to see the trajectory, a trajectory that, if followed to its end, would result in the complete spiritual consumption of humanity's psychic element by the forces of darkness accumulating in the Imperium. The Chaos Gods would eat humanity's soul, not all at once, but progressively, through the shamans first, and then through the increasingly powerful psychers that humanity's evolution was producing, was until there was nothing left of the species' spiritual potential except the empty vessel of a fundamentally non-psychic creature, prey, but not the good kind. And so the shamans made a decision. They gathered from across the entire earth, every shaman still capable of making the journey. Thousands of the most ancient and powerful psychic humans who had ever lived, each carrying within them the accumulated spiritual weight of multiple lifetimes, each holding the reins of a power that most humans of their era could not even have perceived, let alone channeled. They committed collective suicide, every one of them simultaneously pouring every shred of their accumulated psychic might not outward but inward, combining their spiritual power into a single point rather than dispersing it at the moment of death. But it was an act of creation on the level of deliberately engineering a new kind of being, not simply a very powerful psyker, but something categorically new. A consciousness built from the pooled spiritual experience of thousands of ancient souls, each of them carrying the spiritual weight of reincarnated lifetimes, each contributing their unique experience and power to something larger than any of them could have become individually. The Emperor was born on the steppes of what would much later be called Anatolia, somewhere in the vicinity of the 8th millennium before the current calendar. He looked like a child, because that is what he was at that moment, a newly incarnated soul in a new body, which happened to be the most powerful psychic vessel in human history. And from that moment, he walked among his species for tens of thousands of years before anyone outside his most intimate circle understood what he actually was. He could walk among humans because he chose to, because the plan required patience that only an immortal could sustain, because guiding a species toward the kind of psychic maturity that might eventually allow it to survive. The warp's predation required time, measured in millennia rather than centuries. He appeared in countless roles across recorded and unrecorded history. He guided, he protected, quietly, in ways that looked like chance or providence. He waited for the moment when technology and civilization had advanced far enough for the next phase of his plan. But when that moment came, when the stars had been reached and humanity had spread across the hundreds of worlds and the dark age of technology had given way to the old night and then to something new, the Emperor stepped fully into history as himself for the first time, unified old Earth through the Unification Wars, and began the Great Crusade that would carry him across the galaxy. But the crusade, magnificent as it was not the end goal. It was infrastructure. It was the creation of an empire large enough and powerful enough to sustain the actual plan, which was being built in secret beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, hidden from the Primarchs, hidden from the Administratum, hidden from everyone except the Emperor's most trusted inner circle. The plan was the Webway Project, using the ancient Golden Throne, a piece of technology so advanced that even the machine cults of Mars could not fully understand it. As an anchor point, the Emperor was working to extend the Eldari Webway to encompass all of humanity's worlds, not just to create a faster route between the stars, but to give humanity a permanent escape route from the warp. If every human ship could travel through the Webway rather than the warp, if every astropathic communication could flow through Webway channels rather than the Imperium, if the species could gradually move its entire interstellar existence into a dimension that the Chaos Gods could not easily touch, the ruinous powers would lose the richest food source in the galaxy without a single battle being fought. But it went further than that. The Emperor's long-term vision, pieced together from fragments across dozens of lore sources, was not just to hide humanity from chaos, but to guide the species toward a form of psychic evolution that would eventually make it genuinely sovereign over its own spiritual dimension. Humans were becoming increasingly psychic. The 41st millennium's population of psychers is vastly larger than the Great Crusades, and that number is still growing. And the endpoint of that evolution, guided by someone who understood the warp as the Emperor did, could theoretically be a humanity that existed in a balanced, controlled relationship with the Imperium, rather than a predatory one. Not food for the dark gods, but something that could stand in the warp on its own terms. The Chaos gods understood this. Whilst they have a complicated relationship with time, the warp exists outside of linear causality in ways that give its inhabitants a kind of prevision of likely futures, though not certainty. And what they saw in the direction of a completed webway project was something that genuinely alarmed them. An emperor who finished his work was an emperor who would eventually achieve what he was building toward. And what he was building toward was the permanent limitation of the Chaos God's ability to feed on human psychic energy. This is why the corruption of Horus was not simply an act of malice, it was desperation. The four great powers, who almost never cooperate in any genuine sense, because their mutual hostility is as fundamental as their hostility toward the mortal universe, is set aside enough of the great game to jointly engineer the corruption of the Emperor's most beloved son, because the alternative, allowing the webway project to continue, was a threat they could not risk. The corruption itself was a masterwork of chaos manipulation. Horus Lupercal, the greatest of the Primarchs, had begun to harbour doubts that were the products of his own genuine virtues. His love for his brothers, his pride in the Great Crusade, his deep uncertainty about the Emperor's new role in the administratum rather than at the front lines of war. These doubts were real, and they were valid in many ways. The Chaos Gods reached into those doubts not with obvious temptation, but with carefully arranged experience, with visions that were not entirely lies, just with a wounding on the world of Davin that left him vulnerable, and a period of spiritual crisis that allowed the Dark God's influence to take root before anyone realized what was happening. And then Magnus the Red, whose own story is perhaps the most tragic in the heresy cycle, made the mistake that broke everything. Trying to warn his father about Horus's corruption through sorcery, Magnus tore through the psychic wards protecting the Emperor's webway work and shattered years of careful construction in a single moment of well-intentioned catastrophe. The webway flooded with demons. The Emperor was forced to take the Golden Throne to hold the breach, abandoning the war he had been fighting and binding himself to a machine in a room underground, unable to continue the work that was supposed to save humanity. As the Chaos Gods had won that battle, but they had not, 10,000 years later, won the war, because the Emperor, even on the Golden Throne, even with his body crumbling so slowly that whole generations of humanity are born and die between any two visible changes in his condition, continues to be one of the things that the ruinous powers genuinely fear. His psychic presence in the warp is not diminishing, it is growing. The daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers to sustain his consciousness, a practice that is morally horrifying in ways that the Imperium refuses to fully reckon with, because the alternative is the extinction of the species, has turned the Emperor from a single being into something fed by an entire civilization's worth of spiritual energy. What the demons that approach Terra in the warp are not simply repelled by physical defenses or military force. They are driven back by the psychological weight of a presence that is, to them, what absolute darkness is to a flame. Not just hostile, but fundamentally incompatible with their existence. The anathema does not just fight them. The anathema is the specific thing they are made of, something that cannot coexist with. And in the current era, the era Indomitus, following the opening of the Great Rift, there are signs in the lore that the Emperor's long imprisonment may be approaching a change. The Great Rift has supercharged the psychic environment of the galaxy, flooding the Immaterium with energy, drowning out many of the warp's existing patterns with the raw power of chaos unleashed. But the Emperor's presence has not been drowned. At Reboot Gilliman, resurrected by Elder intervention and the Emperor's own distant guidance, reported a conversation with his father on the Golden Throne that he described as deeply disturbing. Not because the Emperor seemed weak, but because he seemed different. Something colder. Something that had outgrown the human container it was still wearing. Servants of chaos across multiple war bands and legions have begun specific operations aimed at disrupting what some of them call the Emperor's ascension. Not his recovery, but something more fundamental. a transformation that the dark gods recognize as the direction of the threat and which they are working urgently to prevent. Part 3. The War in Heaven, when the warp was born in carnage. And why that matters now. Here is something the Chaos Gods might prefer you not think about too carefully. Before the War in Heaven, they barely existed. Not in the form you know them in, not as the vast, self-aware entities with names and courts, and legions, and plans within plans, that they are in the 41st millennium, before the greatest war ever fought in the history of the Warhammer galaxy. The Imperium was a psychic dimension, yes, and it had entities within it, yes, but these entities were relatively minor, relatively disorganized, relatively lacking in the kind of focused malevolent purpose that the four great powers of chaos embody today. The warp before the War in Heaven was turbulent as the warp always is, but it was not the howling, demon-infested, god-ruled nightmare dimension it eventually became. As the War in Heaven made it that. This is one of the law's most important structural facts, and it changes everything about how you understand the Chaos Gods' vulnerability. If the conditions of the War in Heaven created the Chaos Gods, then those conditions, or the reversal of them, remain relevant to the Chaos Gods' continued existence. They are not eternal in the way that the laws of physics are eternal. They are the product of specific events, and while those events cannot be undone, the conditions those events created can potentially be altered. This is the foundation of most of the threats we will discuss. So let us lay out the shape of the War in Heaven, because it deserves to be understood clearly. 60 million years before the 41st millennium, the galaxy was not the multi-faction conflict zone we know from modern 40K lore. It was dominated by two ancient powers in a state of cold hostility that would eventually boil over into something that makes the Horus Heresy look like a minor border skirmish. The Old Ones were among the galaxy's oldest intelligent species, beings of such extraordinary psychic sophistication and technological advancement that most later civilizations would regard them as essentially indistinguishable from gods. They had mastered both the webway and the fundamental forces of the Imperium. They were the galaxy's gardeners, traveling between stars on timescales that made geological epochs seem brief, nurturing life on promising worlds, building an increasingly complex living universe according to their own vision of what the cosmos should be. They were patient and wise and genuinely benevolent in their intentions, right as far as any surviving account can determine. The Necrontyr were, in almost every meaningful way, everything the Old Ones were not. A short-lived species, burning with resentment at their own brevity and consumed by a deep, species-level bitterness toward the Old Ones who had refused to share the secret of long life with them. Their sun was dying, their world was hostile, their natural lifespans were short even by the standards of the mortal galaxy, and they looked out at the stars and saw beings who lived forever and offered them nothing. The resentment this generated was not merely political, it was existential. It was the kind of hatred that writes itself into a species' DNA, that breeds into the culture something implacable and patient and enormously dangerous. When the Necrontyr found the Cetan, the star gods, as ancient beings of pure stellar energy who had drifted through space since the very first moments of the physical universe, and offered them physical bodies in exchange for an alliance against the Old Ones, the balance of galactic power shifted in a way that would not become clear for millennia. The Cetan gave the Necrontyr something that no amount of medical science could have achieved: true immortality. They called it biotransference. Every Necrontyr who participated had their consciousness transferred into a body of living metal, their organic brain pattern preserved in circuits of a material so sophisticated that it could sustain neural activity indefinitely. They became the Necrons, and in exchange for their biological bodies and the souls those bodies carried, they gained the near indestructibility of undying metal. What followed was not a war in any conventional sense of the word. It was the destruction of an entire epoch of galactic civilization over the course of tens of millions of years, fought with weapons so devastating that some of their effects are still detectable in the structure of the galaxy 60 million years later. Planets were razed to bare rock, suns were extinguished, black holes were conjured into being as tactical weapons, consuming entire stellar systems. The Old Ones fought with their mastery of the warp and their vast networks of psychic warrior species. The Necrons and Citan fought with the absolute supremacy of beings who had abandoned the spiritual dimension entirely and operated purely in the physical realm. The psychic residue of this conflict, the billions upon billions of dying souls, as the accumulated trauma and loss and rage and despair and grief and terror generated by these ancient races dying en masse across the entire face of the galaxy, poured into the warp, and the warp responded to it. What had been a relatively formless dimension of ambient psychic energy began to organize. The concentrated emotional weight of the longest, most destructive war in galactic history seeded something in the Imperium that had not been there before in this form. The existing minor entities of the warp were transformed by the influx of charged emotional energy into something far more dangerous. New structures of psychic force congealed around the archetypes that the war had rendered most overwhelming in the experience of those fighting it. Slaughter, disease, desperate scheming to survive, but the extreme sensations of a species pushed past every limit it knew. And the Chaos Gods, still proto-entities rather than the full-formed cosmic beings they would eventually become, stirred in the depths of the Imperium and began to pull themselves into coherent divine shape for the first time. The Old Ones made the situation dramatically worse by doing the thing that proved their ultimate undoing. To fight the soulless Necrons and their Citan masters, beings immune to psychic attack precisely because they had no souls, no connection to the warp that could be exploited, the Old Ones needed to create armies of creatures that were as psychically powerful as the Necrons were psychically inert. So they began engineering species from scratch, writing extraordinary psychic sensitivity into the genetic code of new warrior races that would fight on their behalf. The Eldari were the greatest of these creations, beings of almost incomprehensible psychic refinement, whose spiritual presence in the warp was so powerful that even their ordinary emotional experiences registered in the Imperium with a force that most species' most extreme moments could not match. They were, in every sense the Old Ones intended, a living psychic weapon against Citan and Necron alike, because the Citan, despite their material supremacy, were vulnerable to focused psychic attack from beings whose warp connection was strong enough and stable enough to channel that power as something other than raw destructive energy. The Krork, the massive, brutish, just resilient precursors to the modern orcs, were another such creation, designed not for psychic power, but for the kind of indestructible physical aggression that could engage Necron warriors on their own terms, and keep fighting long after any other species would have broken. Both of these species helped turn the tide, at least temporarily. The Old Ones' Psyker races began to push back against the Necron advance. The war's balance shifted, but the problem was that every one of these new psychic species was pouring yet more emotional energy into the warp, making it wilder and more dangerous, feeding the gestating entities in the Imperium with exactly the fuel they needed to begin pulling themselves together into coherent divine beings. And then the enslavers came. Parasitic warp entities that could reach into the minds of psychers and use their bodies as living doorways between the Imperium and reality. And the Old Ones found themselves fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Their own greatest strength, their mastery of psyker species, was being turned against them. The warrior races they had created were increasingly being taken over from the inside, their bodies turned into gates for the very warp predators the Old Ones had always tried to protect them from. The Old Ones were broken, not quickly, not without enormous resistance, but broken nonetheless, scattered and hunted and eventually lost to history, fled to somewhere else in the cosmos or simply dead, leaving behind only their works and the species they had created, who now had to navigate a galaxy without their creators. And in the warp, nurtured and empowered and given final coherent form, by all that violence and suffering, the Chaos Gods waited. Fully formed now, ancient and patient, and fed on the psychic residue of the greatest war in galactic history.
Okay, quick pause here because we're about halfway through and I just want to say genuinely, this is one of my favorite topics I've ever sat down to cover on this channel. Because the Chaos Gods are so often presented as this unstoppable, eternal wall of darkness, and I think that framing actually undersells how interesting they are. The fear is what makes them real to me. The fact that beings this old and this powerful have specific things they are actively working to prevent tells you more about the nature of the setting than any codex entry. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The war in heaven was their birth in full. Everything that came after has been their life. The reason this matters for our discussion is the core insight it provides. The Chaos Gods are not primordial forces that would exist even without the war in heaven. They exist because of it. The specific conditions of the war in heaven, the psychic activity of vast numbers of sentient beings generating extreme emotional states over millions of years, created the warp environment that allowed the dark gods to achieve full self-aware divinity. Was if those conditions can be reversed, if the warp can be emptied of the turbulent psychic energy that sustains the dark gods, they do not simply get weaker, they become something less than they are. Something that cannot maintain its own coherence against the natural entropy that would pull even a Chaos God apart if left without sustenance. This is the foundational vulnerability. Everything else builds from it. Part 4. The C'tan and their ancient plan to kill the warp. The C'tan hate the warp. Not metaphorically, not in the political sense of one faction opposing another. They hate it the way matter hates antimatter. A deep, structural, existential incompatibility that goes down to the very level of what they are. The C'tan are beings of pure material energy. They evolved, if that is even the right word, for something that began as a spontaneous emergence of organized stellar force in the very early universe. In the purely physical realm, the warp, with its chaotic psychic currents, its emotional resonances, its connection to the inner experience of living beings, is everything the C'tan are not. Where the C'tan are things of mass and energy and physical law, the warp is a dimension of pure psychic experience with no fixed physical properties whatsoever. They are natural opposites. This means that the growing power of the warp that the war in heaven was feeding and strengthening with every decade of carnage, was not an abstract political problem for the C'tan. It was an escalating physical threat. The more powerful the warp became, the more hostile the fundamental environment became to beings of purely material constitution. The C'tan, who had once operated freely across the galaxy with essentially no opposition, found themselves increasingly constrained by the expansion of the Imperium's influence into the material universe, by the way that warp energy could pierce the barrier between dimensions and affect physical reality in ways that were actively harmful to beings of their nature. So while the Necrons were still fighting the war in heaven under C'tan direction, the Star Gods were already planning what to do about the warp on a permanent basis. Not just how to fight the old ones, not just how to win the current war, but how to solve the fundamental problem of a warp that was becoming stronger and more hostile with every year the conflict continued. But their solution was elegant and terrifying in equal measure. They had, in the course of their geological explorations of the galaxy, discovered a material with unique properties, a crystalline mineral, extremely dense, with the property of absorbing and nullifying psychic energy at a local level. They called it Blackstone. In sufficient quantities, properly arranged and energized, Blackstone could generate fields of psychic suppression strong enough to keep the warp from penetrating into a local region of space. In even greater quantities, with the right geometrical arrangement and the right power source, it could theoretically generate a suppression field sufficient to seal the warp from the material universe entirely, a barrier not just around a planet or a system, but around an entire galaxy, separating the Imperium from real space permanently and utterly. No warp in the galaxy, no psychic dimension that Chaos Gods could inhabit. No demonic incursion, no possession, no corruption through the psychic pathways that Chaos uses to reach into the mortal universe. And the Chaos gods themselves, sealed off from the galaxy's living population and its emotional output, would slowly starve, unable to manifest, unable to feed, slowly losing coherence and power across the deep millennia until they were no longer gods at all, but simply large and disorganized knots of psychic energy in a dimension that no longer had access to the food supply they needed. The plan would also kill every psyker in the galaxy immediately, destroy the webway, end all forms of warp travel, and leave the surviving population at the mercy of the Cetan and their Necron servants. But from the perspective of beings who had decided to save the material universe from the warp by eradicating everything that connected the two, these were acceptable costs. The Necrons began constructing the pylon network. Across hundreds of worlds in strategic configurations, vast constructs of Blackstone were raised. Their crystalline matrices tuned to resonate with each other across interstellar distances, building toward the total suppression field that would separate reality from the psychic dimension that had been eating it. But the war ended before the plan could be completed. The Cetan, at the height of their power, at the very moment of final triumph over the Old Ones, they found themselves attacked not by the enemies they had spent millions of years fighting, but by the servants they had thought were completely loyal. The Silent King led the Necron rebellion. The Cetan were shattered into fragments, imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths, stripped of their godhood and reduced to something that could be controlled and deployed as living weapons, rather than worshipped as divine masters. And the pylon network, unfinished, sat across the galaxy's worlds for 60 million years, waiting, dormant but not dead, still faintly resonating, still maintaining a partial suppression effect in certain regions, still capable, if someone with the right knowledge and the right resources ever activated its full potential, of completing what the Cetan had designed. In the 41st millennium, someone is trying to do exactly that. As the Necron pylon network on Cadia was one of the most important pieces of the original Cetan plan, still in existence, when the Black Crusade reached its culmination. Those pylons were doing something that the Imperium had never fully understood, not simply stabilizing the local space near the Eye of Terror, but acting as one of the anchor points for a network that, fully activated, would have created the largest psychic suppression field in the current galaxy. When Abaddon destroyed Cadia and brought those pylons down, the Eye of Terror expanded into the Great Rift, not just because the military defense had collapsed, but because a specific structural restraint on the warp's expansion had been removed. This was not simply a military victory for Chaos. It was a preemptive strike against the possibility of the pylon network ever being completed. The Chaos Gods, or at minimum Abaddon, as their greatest champion, who understood more of their agenda than most, understood that the Cadian pylons were one piece of something larger. Removing that piece was worth the entire resource investment of the 13th Black Crusade. And yet the effort continues. The Silent King, awake in the current era and assessing the state of the galaxy with 60 million years of perspective, has not abandoned the plan. The Pariah Nexus, the expanding region of controlled psychic suppression being built by Necron forces in the current campaign arc, is the first step in rebuilding the network from surviving nodes and newly constructed infrastructure. It is slower and more limited than the original Cetan plan, but it is real and it is growing, and the forces of Chaos have noticed. Vashtor the Archephane arrived at the edge of the Pariah Nexus personally. Not to fight it militarily, Vashtor is not a battlefield commander in the way Horn's champions are, but to observe and interfere and understand what the Necrons were building, because Vashtor, as a being intimately connected to technology and its applications, understood the potential of what he was looking at better than most of the Chaos God's servants could have. His presence at the Nexus speaks to the priority Chaos places on disrupting it. The original Cetan plan failed once. The question the lore leaves open, and which the current campaign arcs are slowly beginning to answer, is whether a modified version of that plan, less total, less immediately catastrophic for mortals, but still fundamentally aimed at reducing the warp's dominance over the material universe, is something that the current galaxy contains enough resources and enough motivated parties to actually accomplish. The Chaos Gods are treating it as if it might be, and that, in itself, tells you something important. Part 5. The Great Devourer, a shadow that swallows the warp whole. Picture a silence, not the silence of an empty room, not the comfortable quiet of a world at peace. Picture a silence that exists in a dimension made entirely of psychic noise, the Imperium, the vast churning sea of emotion and spiritual energy and ancient hunger. A silence that moves through that ocean like a wall of cold, dead air, extinguishing the psychic signatures of every creature it passes over, the way a temperature inversion extinguishes wildfire. Has a silence so complete that even the greatest demons, who have not known genuine fear in millennia, feel something pull at the edges of their immaterial substance when they sense it approaching. A silence that severs the connections between the dark gods and their servants as cleanly as a blade cuts thread, that makes the elaborate schemes of Cinch fold inward because the variables they were built on have been removed, that stills the blood rage Khorne channels through his mortal champions by cutting off the spiritual conduit that carries it. That silence has a name. It is called the Shadow in the Warp, and it is the advanced presence of the Tyranid hive mind. The Tyranids are the most alien thing in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Was not alien in the sense of being non-human. There are hundreds of non-human intelligent species in this universe, and most of them think in ways that mortals can at least partially understand, or at minimum recognize, as a form of thinking. The Tyranids are alien in the way that a forest fire is alien to the concept of civilization. Not wrong exactly, but operating according to a completely different set of values and needs that has no overlap with anything the civilization recognizes as meaningful. They are not individuals with a collective consciousness. They are a single, distributed intelligence, broken into billions of specialized biological instruments, and all of them controlled by the hive mind. An entity of vast intelligence that processes information from every organism in every fleet simultaneously and uses that information to evolve new bioforms with a speed and efficiency that no laboratory could match. What makes the Tyranids unique in the psychic cosmology of the setting is not their biological sophistication or even their tactical effectiveness, as extraordinary as both of those are. It is the nature of their consciousness. The hive mind does not feel, not in the way that matters to the Chaos Gods. There is no fear in the Tyranid swarm, not fear that bleeds into the warp. There is no ambition, no despair, no rage, no lust, no hope. There is only the cold, patient, utterly implacable directive of the hive mind. Consume all available biomass. You adapt the genetic material in that biomass. Use the adapted material to create more efficient organisms. Move on. This is not a simplified description. This is genuinely the totality of what the hive mind is and does. Every Tyranid bioform, from the smallest termagants scuttling through ruins to the vast bioships that drift between star systems like living continents of flesh and chitin, exists purely as an expression of this one directive. Because the hive mind does not experience the kinds of emotions that power the Chaos Gods, and because the billions of organisms it commands are extensions of a single, non-emotive intelligence, rather than individual conscious beings, each generating their own psychic signature, the Tyranid presence in the warp is not a feast, it is an absence, a void. Yet the kind of spiritual dead zone that the Chaos Gods look at the way a fire looks at vacuum. The shadow in the warp is the practical expression of this. As a Tyranid fleet approaches, the sheer mass of the hive mind's non-emotive distributed consciousness pushes against the Imperium the way a very large object displaces water. Psykers caught in the shadow lose their connection to the warp. Their powers fade, their communications fail, their ability to navigate through the Imperium goes dark and silent. For the Imperium, this is tactical horror. Entire planetary systems go silent as the shadow falls. cut off from astropathic communication, unable to call for reinforcements, alone in a growing darkness that offers no explanation, for the demons and servants of chaos operating in the affected regions. And it is something qualitatively different. Their connection to their gods simply disappears. A demon manifesting in the material universe within the shadow finds itself weakening rapidly, its connection to the warp that sustains its immaterial existence fraying and then simply ending, like a candle whose oxygen has been removed. Sustaining material presence becomes first difficult and then impossible. There are documented cases in the lore of chaos forces abandoning positions and retreating, not because the Tyranids had physically driven them out, but because the psychic environment created by the hive mind's advance had made it impossible for demonic entities to remain coherent in real space. But the deeper threat, the one that the Chaos Gods are not willing to simply wait out as they would wait out most military threats, is the long-term implication of what the Tyranids actually do when they consume a world. Every organic molecule is harvested, every living thing is absorbed, every ecosystem is stripped to its bare chemical components and recycled into new bioforms. When a Tyranid fleet is finished with a planet, there is nothing left on its surface except barren rock, not ruins of civilization, not bodies, not soil microbes, not the residual psychic impressions that even dead worlds carry for millions of years after their populations are gone. Nothing. For the Chaos Gods, this is ultimately an existential problem. They are fed by the emotional output of sentient life. No sentient life means no emotional output. Yes, no emotional output means no sustenance. The Chaos Gods will not starve immediately if a single planet is consumed. They are ancient and vast, and the loss of one world's worth of psychic fuel registers about as much as losing a single drop from an ocean. But the Tyranids are not consuming individual planets. They are consuming galaxies. The lore strongly suggests that the hive fleets arriving in the Milky Way are the advance edge of something far larger, that the hive mind has already consumed multiple nearby galaxies before turning its attention to ours, that the scale of what is coming behind the current invasion fleets is orders of magnitude larger than what has already arrived. A galaxy with no life is a galaxy where the Chaos Gods slowly starve. Yet the warp would not disappear immediately. It is too large and too ancient and too charged for that. But it would lose the constant replenishment of psychic energy that keeps the Dark Gods at their current power. They would diminish, over millions of years perhaps, but relentlessly and irreversibly, because the Tyranids do not leave anything behind that could eventually repopulate a world and begin the process of emotional output again. And there is nothing in the Chaos Gods' toolkit that addresses this problem. Every weapon in their arsenal was designed for use against beings with individual wills that can be corrupted and subverted. Against an enemy with no individual self, those weapons simply do not function. You cannot tempt a creature that feels no desire. Whilst you cannot corrupt an intelligence that has no individual component capable of valuing itself over the collective, you cannot threaten a being that holds no individual fear of death, because the hive mind's components die constantly, by the millions in a single major engagement, and the hive mind continues, completely indifferent to those losses, learning from them and adapting around them with the cold efficiency of a process rather than the grief of a person. The Chaos Gods face a threat that is immune to every form of power they know how to use, and which, if left unchecked, will simply eat all of their food. Part 6. Hive Fleet Kronos, the living weapon against the warp. If the general Tyranid threat to chaos is unsettling enough on its own terms, wishes there is a specific development in recent 40,000 lore that escalates the situation considerably. Hive Fleet Kronos. Kronos is not the largest Tyranid hive fleet currently active. In terms of raw mass, it is probably smaller than Leviathan or Kraken, but it is distinctive for something that no other hive fleet has demonstrated. Not just the absence of warp sensitivity that all Tyranids share, but an active, apparent tactical intent directed specifically against chaos corruption and warp activity. The hive mind, which processes information from every organism across every fleet, and uses that information to continuously optimize its approach to the problem of galactic consumption, encountered a specific problem after the opening of the Great Rift. Warp corruption and demonic energy makes biomass less nutritionally useful, so corrupted organic material saturated with chaos energy is not good fuel for the biological processes the hive mind runs. It is, in the most literal possible sense, bad food. So the hive mind, with the cold efficiency that characterizes every decision it makes, began adapting a portion of its forces specifically to address this problem, to clear the warp contamination from regions before consuming them, or to preferentially consume the chaos-tainted elements in ways that neutralized rather than absorbed their corruption. Hive Fleet Kronos is what emerged from that adaptation process, a fleet specifically tuned for the systematic elimination of chaos activity and warp corruption. And its shadow in the warp is the most powerful of any currently active hive fleet, pushed to such intensity that it can not merely disrupt demonic manifestation, but actively suppress and close warp rifts if its forces concentrate the shadow's effect long enough in a specific location. In documented engagements, Kronos has arrived at worlds where chaos invasions were ongoing, deployed its shadow to close the warp rift supplying the invading forces, stranded those forces in the material universe without a route of retreat or resupply, and then consumed both the chaos-touched planet and the now isolated demonic entities in a single clean campaign. Consider what this means from the perspective of a demon, an ancient entity that has survived since before the Horus Heresy, that has torn through space marine companies and broken planetary civilizations, that has walked the material universe in the service of its patron god for thousands of years. And then the shadow falls. The connection to the warp closes. The sustaining link to the Imperium that keeps an immaterial being coherent in real space simply ends, as completely and irrevocably as a wire being cut. And approaching from the tree line, utterly silent, utterly indifferent to anything the demon might say or offer or threaten, a tide of biological forms whose minds register as nothing, not hostile, not afraid, simply absent, the way a field of machine parts is absent of any mind, move forward to consume everything that remains. There is no appeal to be made, no bargain available, no individual vanity to exploit, no vulnerability to cruelty or power, but no part of the approaching intelligence that could be made to understand why it should stop. The demon faces, perhaps for the first time in its long existence, something that it genuinely cannot influence in any direction. Something that does not hate it, does not want to destroy it as an act of will, does not even register it as anything more than an obstacle between the hive mind and the biomass it needs. This is the specific texture of what Hive Fleet Kronos represents to Chaos forces. Not merely a military threat, but a kind of cosmic indifference that has no countermeasure in the Dark God's entire catalogue of tools for dealing with opposition. In the ongoing narrative of the Pariah Nexus and the broader Era Indomitus campaign, where Kronos has been actively redirected by the hive mind toward regions of high warp activity, moving through areas the Great Rift has made most accessible to chaos influence, leaving behind zones of psychic silence. It is not strategically directed against chaos in the way a military campaign is directed toward a goal. The hive mind has no idea what the chaos gods are, or why eliminating their influence might matter beyond the quality of the biomass. But the functional effect of Kronos' movements is a systematic reduction of chaos activity along its path of advance, and the chaos gods, who can sense patterns in the warp that mortals cannot, have noticed the correlation. Part 7. Iniad, the god being born to kill a god, there is a specific quality of threat that the chaos gods probably should have anticipated. Since given that they themselves came into being through this exact mechanism, a new being growing in the warp, assembled from accumulated souls, whose entire purpose, at the moment of its full awakening, will be the destruction of one of the existing four. Iniad, the whispering god, the Eldari god of the dead, who has not yet fully been born. In the current lore of the era Indomitus, Iniad exists in a state of advanced gestation in the collective infinity circuits of the Eldari craft world, a vast potential presence in the Imperium that has not yet fully manifested into a being capable of direct action in the way the other warp gods can act, but whose growth is measurable, whose power is real, and whose purpose has never been in any doubt. That purpose is the destruction of Slaanesh. I seem to understand why this is a genuine cosmic threat, rather than just an interesting piece of alien mythology. You need to understand the spiritual mechanics of the Eldari, their relationship to the warp, and the specific nature of Slaanesh's claim on them. When an Eldari dies, their soul does not simply disperse. The Eldari have a psychic connection to the spiritual dimension that is deeper and more powerful than any other currently living species. And this means their souls retain coherence and strength at the moment of death in a way that most species' souls do not. Under ordinary cosmological circumstances, this coherent soul would eventually make its way through the warp, experience whatever the Immaterium offers to the dead, and eventually dissolve back into the general psychic background. But there is nothing ordinary about the Eldari's cosmological circumstances. Slaanesh was born from their civilization's excess. The Prince of Pleasure was created, in part, by the collective psychic weight of 10,000 years of Eldari decadence. And when Slaanesh achieved full awakening, one of the first things it did, perhaps the first thing, in the violent moment of its birth, was consume most of the Eldari gods that had previously existed. After that consuming, Slaanesh established a claim on the Eldari race that functions as both predation and something like possession. Every Eldari soul that passes into the warp without specific protection is hunted and eaten by the Prince of Pleasure, who regards the entire Eldari species as both its inheritance and its most prized ongoing meal. The Eldari have spent 10,000 years trying to manage this situation. The soul stones they wear in battle, which capture their soul at the moment of death and preserve it in crystalline stasis until it can be transferred to the infinity circuit of a craft world. The great ships themselves, which carry the stored souls of generations of their dead in communal spiritual reserves, safe from Slaanesh's reach behind the craft world's psychic defenses. The Dark Elders' entirely different and considerably darker method of dealing with the same problem through the regular draining of others' life force to keep Slaanesh's hunger directed elsewhere. All of these are responses to the same underlying truth. Slaanesh is always hunting them, always hungry, and only active and ongoing effort keeps the remaining Eldari from being consumed. But something was happening in the infinity circuits over the centuries that the Eldari seers began to notice and carefully track. The souls were not merely sitting in the circuits, preserved and static. They were interacting with each other, reinforcing each other, slowly building something in the warp that was larger than the sum of their individual parts. A new psychic presence was taking shape in the Immaterium, not from the living emotions of the Eldari, but from the accumulated dead, from the preserved weight of an entire species worth of souls who had died carrying in them the specific feeling that is hope mixed with grief. The hope that the species would survive. The grief of knowing how close to extinction it had always been. A very specific kind of soul stuff that was, apparently, is exactly what was needed to build a god of a particular character. That presence is Iniad, growing in the collective spiritual treasury of 10,000 years of protected Eldari dead, toward the moment of full awakening. The original Eldari understanding of this process was grim, in a way that is characteristic of this species. The god could only achieve the power necessary to defeat Slaanesh when it contained the souls of every remaining Eldari, because it needed the spiritual weight of the entire race to match a deity of Slaanesh's magnitude. An entire species committing spiritual self-sacrifice to power a weapon built from their collective remains. The Eldari have always had a tragic relationship with their own existence. Recent lore, specifically the Gathering Storm series and subsequent publications, has developed this in a direction that is both more hopeful and more immediately relevant. Yvraine, the daughter of Shades, was chosen by the partially awakening Inead as its prophet and representative in the material universe. She founded the Inari, a faction drawing from every Eldari subculture, Craftworld, and Drukhari, and Harlequin, and Exodite, united around the mission of fully awakening Inead through the seventh path, a ritual method that does not require the extinction of the species. The partial awakening alone was sufficient to demonstrate that Inead's growing presence in the warp registers as genuinely alarming to the forces of chaos. The lore confirms what the pattern suggests. Inead is anathema to the chaos gods in the same way the Emperor is the anathema, not just dangerous, but constitutionally threatening, a being whose very existence in the warp pushes back against the principles that the ruinous powers embody. Chaos forces have intervened against the Inari on multiple occasions, with a focus and urgency that does not fit the Inari's military significance. They are a relatively small faction by the standards of the galaxy's great powers, not the kind of force that normally demands the personal attention of Chaos champions and demon princes. The Thousand Sons of Ahriman attacked them specifically. Multiple Chaos warbands have treated disrupting the Seventh Path as a mission priority that outweighs other operations. Something in what Inead is becoming, and something in the specific threat that the completed awakening would represent, motivates this response in a way that pure military calculation does not explain. Slaanesh fears Inead the way fire fears water, not because water is larger or necessarily more powerful in abstract terms, but because water is the specific thing that ends fire. The Prince of Pleasure has spent 10,000 years eating Eldari souls, building its power on the specific psychic signature of that ancient and sophisticated race, and now are being assembled from those very same souls, transmuted by 10,000 years of careful spiritual preservation and the specific emotional mixture of grief and hope that the Eldari dead carry, is growing in the warp with the explicit purpose of turning that consumption against its consumer. Every Eldari soul Slaanesh has eaten may have contributed, in some cosmic accounting, to the power of the being now growing in opposition to it. There is a symmetry there that the lore leaves elegantly unstated. Part 8. The Orcs, the race that Chaos simply cannot eat. There is something almost refreshing about the Orcs' position in the cosmological landscape of Warhammer 40,000. Almost every other major intelligent species has a complicated, fraught, genuinely dangerous relationship with the Chaos gods. Humans provide the richest food source in the galaxy, billions of emotionally complex, spiritually vulnerable, psychically active individuals, each generating a constant stream of the kinds of feelings that power the dark gods, each carrying within them the specific fears and desires and griefs that have sustained the ruinous powers since humanity first developed the capacity for complex inner experience. The Eldari, with their intense psychic connection to the warp and their specific vulnerability to Slaanesh, are valuable prey in a different way, more intense, more spiritually nutritious per individual, albeit fewer in number. Even the Toe, who have almost no warp presence and are largely invisible to psychic entities, are beginning to generate enough collective psychic mass from their devotion to the greater good that a new entity has apparently formed in the warp in their image. Every sentient species generates something that Chaos can use, even if it is only the passive emotional background radiation of beings going about their lives. The Orcs, on the other hand, are a sustained frustration for the ruinous powers, not because they are morally admirable or spiritually disciplined, not because they have developed clever theological defenses against demonic corruption, but because of what they are at the genetic and psychological level. The Orcs are simply bad food for the Chaos gods, and no amount of effort by the forces of Chaos has ever meaningfully changed that. Let us understand why. The Orcs were designed by the Old Ones as biological war machines, and that origin shows in everything about them. Unlike humanity, which evolved its psychology over millions of years of varied experience and developed the full rich spectrum of emotion that complexity produces, the Orc's psychological profile was written at the genetic level with a specific purpose in mind. They want to fight. The sight of a good fight makes them happy. Winning a good fight makes them bigger and stronger. Being bigger and stronger means finding better fights. The cycle completes and repeats from birth to death, with no room in it for the kinds of existential complexity that chaos feeds on. There is no orc lying awake in the dark hours before dawn, consumed by ambition that outstrips its current station, wondering if there might be a way to gain more power through betrayal. The orc's ambition is satisfied the moment it finds a good scrap. There is no orc tormented by the creeping despair of watching everything it cares about slowly dying around it. The orc cares about fighting, and fighting is never in short supply. There is no orc yearning for sensations that go beyond what its current life provides, because its current life provides exactly what its genetics have designed it to want. Yes, this radical simplicity of psychological profile means that the orc's emotional output, from the perspective of the chaos gods, is nutritionally limited in specific and important ways. The rich, layered, complicated despair of a human soldier watching their civilization crumble over decades. That is genuinely valuable to Nurgle. The burning ambition of a general willing to sacrifice principle for advancement, so it essentially feeds on that. The ecstasy of sensation pushed past all reasonable limit. Sensation as the organizing principle of a life. Slaanesh thrives on that. The orc equivalents of all these things are too simple, too direct, too lacking in the psychic complexity that makes other species' inner lives such productive warp fuel. The orc fighting is enjoyment, not desperation or hunger for power. The orc growing bigger is satisfaction, not ambition. The distinction matters at the level where the chaos gods operate. Moreover, the orcs have their own gods, and those gods fulfill a spiritual function for the species that effectively closes the door to outside influence. Gork and Mork, the twin deities of the orc pantheon, are real warp entities by the mechanics of the setting, real in the sense that they are genuine psychic presences in the Imperium, assembled from the collective spiritual output of the orc species over its long history, powered by the collective belief and emotional energy of billions of greenskins spread across the galaxy. They are not chaos gods. They emerged from a specific species rather than from the general emotional background of the galaxy, and they do not serve the same cosmic function as the four great powers, but they are the spiritual counterpart to the orc species, and they perform a function that the ruinous powers cannot override. When an orc channels its psychic energy through a weird boy, through the collective psychic field that allows orc technology to function on belief rather than physics, through the emotional crescendo of a large enough gathering of orcs working themselves into a battle frenzy, that energy flows toward Gork and Mork, not toward Khorne or Slaanesh. The spiritual circuit runs through gods that have no interest in serving the ruinous powers, and that the ruinous powers cannot easily subvert because they are too alien, too rooted in a specific species' particular kind of consciousness. There is also the matter of biological resistance. Attempts to corrupt orcs with chaos, to mutate them, to possess their psyches, to turn them toward the service of the ruinous powers, as chaos cultists or demon hosts, consistently run into the problem that the orc's psychology does not provide the purchase that corruption requires. The dark gods corrupt through the cracks in a being's character, through the places where desire or fear or pride overrides their better judgment and opens a gap that something external can widen. The orc does not have those cracks in a form that chaos can use. An orc wants to fight. If you offer it a fight in exchange for service, it will take the fight and then immediately ignore the service. If you threaten it with something worse than a fight, it regards this as a challenge rather than a deterrent. If you try to seduce it with pleasure beyond fighting, the concept does not pass. Even demonic possession of orc psyches, which does happen in rare documented cases, produces results that are more comic than concerning. The demon finds itself not in control of a corrupted shell, but engaged in an ongoing argument with a consciousness that has no concept of submission to an external will. The orc host continues to act like an orc. The demon can influence certain actions but cannot take over, cannot corrupt the fundamental purpose, cannot make the orc into a vector for chaos in any meaningful way. The possession frequently ends with the demon being shouted at aggressively enough that it retreats back to the warp rather than continue the engagement. The broader significance for our discussion is this: the orcs represent an enormous permanent absence in the Chaos God's feeding ground. Whilst there may be more orcs in the galaxy at any given moment than any other intelligent species, their reproductive cycle is fast. Their spores can seed worlds with entire populations. Their capacity to survive in hostile environments is almost without limit. This means there is always an enormous fraction of the galaxy's total psychic output being generated by beings that chaos cannot consume, cannot corrupt, and cannot redirect toward the service of the ruinous powers. It is not food kept away by a lock. It is food that is structurally and permanently indigestible, and no amount of cooking will change that. Part 9. The Star Child, the Emperor's Second Coming. There is a theory that has circulated in the lore since the earliest editions of Warhammer 40,000, and referred to by Bidsa's in-universe scholars as the Star Child. The possibility that the Emperor of Mankind is not simply dying slowly on the Golden Throne, but is, in that prolonged process of dying, preparing to be reborn as something that the Chaos Gods have very specific and well-founded reasons to dread. The logic of this begins with the Emperor's nature, which we established earlier. He is the product of a mass sacrifice by all of humanity's ancient shamans, carrying within him the accumulated spiritual weight of thousands of souls who had each accumulated power through multiple lifetimes of reincarnation. And the shamans could reincarnate. Their pooled essence, concentrated into the Emperor at the moment of their sacrifice, retained that capacity at some fundamental level, the ability to release from a dying body, move through the warp, and accumulate additional power or experience there, and eventually reconstitute in a new physical form. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has been unable to act on this capacity because his body remains technically alive. The Golden Throne's machinery keeps the last embers of biological function going, and a soul cannot complete the reincarnation process while its body still breathes. The Emperor is caught between life and death in a way that prevents either resolution, too alive to be released, too broken to act, sustained in a liminal state that was never supposed to be permanent. But that does not mean the soul has been sitting idle in that time. The most recent and most authoritative law to address this comes from the end of the Horus Heresy novel series, the final volumes of the Siege of Terror cycle, which revealed something important about the events at the end of the heresy. When the Emperor killed Horus, he did so at a cost beyond the physical wounds that left him shattered. Facing his greatest son, at the height of Horus's warp-infused power, the Emperor needed to excise from himself the qualities that were making him vulnerable: his grief, his love, his mercy, his hope, because those very human qualities were being exploited by the dark gods through Horus, were being used as leverage against his ability to act decisively. In a moment of terrible and deliberate self-surgery, the Emperor cast those qualities from himself, did not destroy them, cast them away. That discarded portion of the Emperor's psyche, his compassion, his hope, his capacity for love, dispersed into the warp at the moment of that excision. Orson has been drifting there ever since, accumulating, growing, slowly building form around itself, the way a seed accumulates material around its core to eventually become something much larger than it started as. This fragment is the Star Child. Around it, drawn by its nature, has accumulated the spiritual residue of 10,000 years of human worship and sacrifice. Not the raw power of the psyche sacrifices that sustain the Emperor's physical form, but the more diffuse emanation of billions of humans who have lived and died believing in the Emperor's divinity, carrying within them a reflection of his positive qualities as a kind of collective spiritual memory. The Emperor told humanity not to worship him, and they worshipped him anyway. And the psychic shape of that worship is human hope, and human love, and human endurance, the specific qualities the Emperor cast away. These are being drawn to the Star Child in the warp as inevitably as metal filings to a magnet. And what they are building around that growing core is a being of a kind the warp has not housed before. The Chaos Gods are, it turns out, paying attention. Specific servants of chaos have been pursuing operations directed against what the law refers to as the Emperor's potential ascension, not his recovery from the injuries that keep him on the Golden Throne, but something that happens when the Golden Throne finally fails and the Emperor's soul is released whole into the warp. The demon Tenebrous, servant of Tzeentch, has taken specific actions in the current era aimed at preventing this outcome. Corphaeron, as the word-bearer, Chaos Lord, who perhaps understands the theology of the Emperor better than any other Chaos champion, has made it a priority concern. Black Library references to Chaos forces mobilizing specifically to prevent what they call the Star Child's birth have become more frequent in recent publications. What the Chaos Gods appear to understand is this: if the Emperor dies on the Golden Throne and his soul is released intact, not scattered and consumed but released whole, with the full accumulated weight of 10,000 years of sacrifice psychers behind it, that soul will reunite with the Star Child, the fragment of his compassion and hope that has been growing in the warp. And the being that emerges from that reunion will be something new, not the Emperor as he was, not a Chaos God in the existing mold. It was something assembled from the specific spiritual material that represents everything the four ruinous powers are not: ordered consciousness, deliberate compassion, the cultivation of life rather than its exploitation. A being of that nature, fully formed in the warp and carrying the psychic weight of humanity's collective faith behind it, would be a fifth power in the Imperium. Not a Chaos God, but a being of equal or greater magnitude, oriented toward fundamentally different principles, immune to the tools of corruption and subversion that the Chaos Gods use against mortal beings. Something that could challenge them in their own domain from a position of genuine strength, not as a mortal champion fighting with borrowed weapons, but as a full warp entity, matching them at the level of spiritual reality. As this is what the Chaos Gods want to prevent. This is why the Golden Throne's slow failure is, from their perspective, simultaneously desirable and terrifying. Desirable because a living emperor on a failing throne is currently serving their interests by keeping his soul tethered and unable to complete the transformation. Terrifying because the failure they are cultivating will eventually reach the point where it can no longer be maintained at its current level. And then the question of what the emperor becomes will stop being theoretical. The cold distance that Guilliman perceived in his conversation with the Emperor on the Golden Throne, the sense that the being sitting there had grown beyond the human father he remembered, may not be evidence of deterioration. It may be evidence of preparation. 10,000 years of thinking, 10,000 years of feeling the Dark God's pressure, 10,000 years of understanding exactly what the warp is and what the Chaos Gods need, and what would be required to finally, genuinely oppose them at the level where they are vulnerable. When the Emperor finally speaks, and what he says may be the most consequential moment in the history of the setting. Part 10. The Necron Pylons and the Pariah Nexus. The old plan, rebuilt, we established earlier how the Cetan originally planned to seal the warp from the material universe 60 million years ago, and how that plan was interrupted by the Necron Rebellion. Now let us examine what the Necrons are actually doing in the current era of the law. Here, because the Silent King has not forgotten the plan, and the forces of chaos have been spending considerable resources trying to ensure he never completes it. The Pariah Nexus is a region of space in the current campaign arc that is expanding under Necron direction through the systematic deployment of Blackstone pylons. Within its boundaries, the effects are specific and measurable. Warp travel becomes extremely difficult and unreliable. Psychic abilities are suppressed to the point of near uselessness. Astropathic communication fails completely. Demonic manifestation requires so much additional energy that sustained presence in the region is essentially impossible, and the influence of the Chaos Gods, which normally bleeds through the boundary between the immaterium and real space, with varying levels of intensity, is reduced to almost nothing within the Nexus's range. The human response to operating within the Pariah Nexus has been documented across multiple campaign supplements. and is consistently described as profoundly unsettling. Sisters of Battle, whose faith-based abilities depend on some connection to the spiritual dimension, report those abilities functioning poorly or not at all. Psychers are driven to a kind of madness by the complete absence of the psychic background they have always experienced, the way a person accustomed to constant sound might be distressed by total silence. The psychological effect of having the spiritual component of reality simply removed from your experience is something that the human mind does not handle gracefully, even when the removal protects you from the worst the warp can offer. For Chaos Forces, was the experience inside the Pariah Nexus is something qualitatively different and considerably more severe. Demon engines lose their animating warp energy and become inert machinery. Chaos Space Marines find their mutations, the physical gifts of their patron gods, the marks of divine favor that set them apart from their loyalist counterparts, beginning to fade, their bodies trying to revert to the baseline human physiology that the warp has been distorting for centuries or millennia. Sorcerers and psychers whose entire practice is built on channeling the Imperium become ordinary and vulnerable in ways they are entirely unprepared for. The principle at work is identical to what the Citan designed 60 million years ago, just implemented at a smaller scale. Remove the warp from the equation in a given region of space, and everything that depends on the warp for its existence or its power simply stops working. Chaos forces that look almost invincible in normal space become much more ordinary problems when stripped of their supernatural advantages. What the Silent King is building toward, according to the trajectory suggested by current law, is an expansion of the Pariah Nexus's principles into a network of sufficient coverage to meaningfully constrain the Chaos God's access to the material universe across significant portions of the galaxy. Not the total severance the Citan originally planned, at least not yet. The technology and resources for that do not currently exist, and the Cadian pylons, one of the key anchors of the original network, were destroyed in the 13th Black Crusade. But a partial implementation, yet a network of suppression zones connected by underground infrastructure, would represent a meaningful rollback of Chaos's influence in the galaxy and a permanent degradation of the ruinous power's ability to operate in the affected regions. This is precisely why the Chaos Gods moved against Cadia when they did. The 13th Black Crusade, after 12 previous failed attempts, finally achieved its goal. But the goal was not simply the destruction of a strategically important fortress world, as devastating as that was for the Imperium. The goal was the elimination of the most significant surviving node of the original pylon network. With Cadia gone, the Great Rift could open. With the Great Rift open, Chaos's position in the galaxy was dramatically strengthened, and the specific network that might have eventually been used to begin undoing that advantage was prevented from being completed. But it was not destroyed entirely. The Necrons were already waking before Cadia fell. The Silent King's return to the galaxy preceded the opening of the Great Rift, and his first priority upon returning was the assessment of the pylon network's status. What he found was a galaxy in worse shape than what he had left, the warp more powerful than it had been in his sleeping era, the corrupted biomass more widespread, and the Chaos Gods more firmly entrenched, but also a galaxy that still had active pylons on hundreds of worlds, that still had the deep memory of how the network was supposed to function encoded in the databanks of waking Necron dynasties, and that still had the technical capacity to rebuild. Vashdor arrived at the edge of the Pariah Nexus because the Archifine understood what it represented. Not all of the forces responding to the Nexus understand its full strategic significance. Many Chaos warlords attacking it are following orders whose deeper purpose they do not know. But Vashtor, whose domain is the intersection of technology and dark power, could read the engineering of the Blackstone network and understand what it was building toward. His presence was not an accident and not mere opportunism. It was the recognition of a serious threat, handled personally because the potential consequences of letting it proceed justified personal attention. Part 11. The Great Game. Why chaos is its own worst enemy. There is one final vulnerability of the chaos gods that deserves its own section, and it is perhaps the most fundamental of all, the deep structural enmity between the four great powers themselves. The great game is the eternal struggle for dominance between Horn, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh in the Warp. This is not a political rivalry that could be resolved through negotiation or a military competition that might someday produce a clear winner. It is a metaphysical opposition built into the very nature of what each god is. Horn embodies martial directness and the purity of violence. Tzeentch embodies manipulation, sorcery, and the infinite complexity of scheming. The blood god despises everything Tzeentch is, because sorcery is power achieved through means other than honest strength. And Tzeentch regards Horn's approach as too simple to be interesting. Nurgle embodies stagnation, the acceptance of decay, was the warm communal rot of things becoming other things slowly. Slaanesh embodies the hunger for constant sensation and new experience, the individual's insatiable drive for more, always more, and finds Nurgle's contentment with decay repulsive and incomprehensible. These oppositions are not contingent, they are essential. Each chaos god is a single emotional archetype, taken to its absolute extreme, and those archetypes are built on foundations that genuinely contradict each other at the deepest level. They cannot cooperate in any sustained way, because cooperation would require compromising the principles that define what each of them is, and a chaos god cannot compromise its defining principle without ceasing to be what it is. This is the crack at the center of everything chaos does in the galaxy, and it is the reason that despite the four dark gods' individually overwhelming power, they have not simply crushed all opposition and claimed the galaxy they have been contesting for tens of millions of years. Every time the powers of chaos come close to a unified strategy, every time a champion powerful enough to coordinate all four factions arises, every time the great game pauses long enough for something approaching a united front, the internal contradictions reassert themselves. Tzeentch's agents work against Khorne's at exactly the moment when coordination would be decisive. Nurgle's followers spread their corruption into territory that Slaanesh had been cultivating, and the resulting conflict between chaos factions creates the gaps that mortal resistance needs to survive. The Horus heresy is the clearest example in the lore. The corruption of Horus was a genuine cooperative effort by all four powers, a moment of unusual unity driven by the specific threat that the Emperor's Webway project represented. They succeeded in corrupting Horus. They succeeded in starting the civil war. They succeeded in driving the traitor legions to terror. And then, in the moment of potential final victory, the great game reasserted itself. The ruinous powers each wanted a specific outcome from the Siege of Terror that was incompatible with what the others wanted. The result was a failure of final coordination at the precise moment when coordination was most critical, and the Emperor survived long enough to kill Horus and deny Chaos the complete victory it had been working toward. Every force in the galaxy that opposes Chaos benefits from the Great Game, whether they understand it or not. Every time Khornate and Tzeentchian warbands clash over competing objectives, they are doing the work of every Chaos opponent in the galaxy. Every time Nurgle's servants spread their corruption into Slaanesh's claimed territory and trigger a conflict between demonic legions, the window of mortal resistance that conflict creates is a gift that costs nothing to receive. The combined opposition of Emperor, Necrons, Tyranids, Inead, Orcs, and the Starchild's potential would be formidable under any circumstances. Against four gods who cannot decide whose plan takes priority long enough to respond effectively, the opposition becomes something the lore has been hinting toward for decades, a genuine possibility of a different outcome. Part 12. The Perpetuals, the Void Dragon, and the quieter threats nobody talks about. There is a certain category of threat to the Chaos Gods that sits just outside the main discussion because it is either too speculative, too quietly embedded in specific corners of the lore, or simply too understated to draw the kind of attention the major forces receive. But understated is not the same as unimportant, and a few of these deserve space in any honest accounting of what the dark gods have reason to worry about. Let us start with the perpetuals. Most people who engage with Warhammer 40,000 through the main game and basic lore are aware of psychers, of the Space Marines' enhanced physiology, of the broad categories of superhuman and supernatural being that populate the setting. Fewer people have spent time in the Horus Heresy novel series, as where one of the most important pieces of cosmological infrastructure was quietly developed across dozens of books without ever being announced as such. The perpetuals are human beings who cannot die, not in any final sense. They can be killed. Their bodies can be destroyed in ways that are thorough enough to require lengthy recovery times, but they return. The death does not hold. They heal from injuries that should be fatal, come back from states of physical destruction that should be permanent, and have been doing this long enough that some of them remember the world before the Imperium, before the Emperor's unification campaign, before recorded history in any form that conventional scholarship can reach. What makes the perpetuals relevant to our discussion is the specific question of why they exist and what they represent in the cosmological framework of the setting. The Horus Heresy novels make it clear that the perpetuals are not accidents, not random mutations, not the product of individual psychic development. They are, in some sense, that the lore leaves deliberately opaque, designed, or at least selected for by something. The Emperor himself is the most significant perpetual, his deathlessness a product of the ancient shaman's sacrifice and his own accumulated power. But there are others who arose independently, who did not come from that specific origin point, and whose presence suggests that the capacity for human immortality is built into the species at some deep level, waiting to be unlocked under conditions that are not fully understood. Alanius Pius, Erda, John Grammaticus, Vulcan. Each of these figures carries a different specific flavor of immortality, and each was drawn into the events of the Horus Heresy in ways that had significance beyond their individual military contributions. John Grammaticus, in particular, operated as an agent of the Cabal, a group of Zeno's scholars who had spent millennia studying the Chaos Gods and reached a conclusion that the Emperor himself ultimately rejected, that the only way to permanently end the threat of chaos was to allow Horus to win completely, to destroy the Imperium so thoroughly that humanity's collective psychic output collapsed, starving the Dark Gods permanently. The Cabal's plan was, in its horrible way, internally consistent. However, if chaos feeds on humanity's psychic complexity, then removing humanity from the equation removes the food source, and a galaxy without humanity would be one where the Dark Gods slowly dwindled. The Emperor refused this solution, and his reasons for refusing it tell us something important. A galaxy without humanity is a galaxy where the Chaos Gods lose their richest food source, yes, but it is also a galaxy where the single most significant psychic force opposed to chaos has been permanently removed. The Emperor believed that humanity's potential, properly developed and directed, represented not merely a food source for the Dark Gods, but a genuine counterweight. That human psychic capacity, channeled correctly rather than left to generate the wild emotional static that currently feeds the ruinous powers. He could eventually produce something that opposed chaos more effectively than any mere suppression or starvation. He was playing a longer game than the Cabal's calculation accounted for, and the Starchild theory suggests he understood, even then, what that longer game was moving toward. The Perpetuals are relevant because they exist in a universe where the Chaos Gods have been working to ensure that no mortal being lives long enough to accumulate the kind of understanding needed to genuinely oppose them. 10,000 years is nothing to a Chaos God, barely a meaningful unit of time in their cosmic reckoning, but a Perpetual who has lived for 20 or 30,000 years, who has watched civilizations rise and fall, who has seen the Chaos God's patterns repeat across millennia, and learned from each repetition, that being accumulates a quality of understanding that the Dark Gods find genuinely concerning. The Emperor on the Golden Throne has spent 10,000 years doing essentially nothing but thinking and observing, and whatever conclusions that process has produced are kept private for reasons that seem increasingly strategic as you consider what he might have figured out. Now let us talk about something very different: the Void Dragon. The Void Dragon is the C'tan shard that the Emperor of Mankind defeated and imprisoned beneath the surface of Mars during the Dark Age of technology. The imprisonment occurred long before the heresy, long before any of the events that define the current 40,000 era. And it was performed not because the Emperor wanted the C'tan's power available to him, but because destroying a C'tan shard entirely was beyond his capacity to achieve safely without risking catastrophic collateral damage on a scale that would have undermined the purpose of the unification he was pursuing. The Void Dragon has rested beneath the Martian surface for 20,000 plus years. Its dreams, leaking into the material universe in a muted and distorted form, are the reason that Mars is the center of humanity's mechanical theology, why the Adeptus Mechanicus developed the Omnissiah as the divine principle underlying all technology, why the forge worlds of the Mechanicus produce such extraordinary machines despite relying on liturgical processes that seem antithetical to actual engineering, why the relationship between humanity and its own technology has always had this faintly spiritual undertone that makes no rational sense until you know that one of the most powerful psychic entities in the history of the galaxy is sleeping under the planet where all of humanity's most important technology is developed. The Void Dragon is not a threat to the Chaos Gods in the way the Tyranids or the Necrons are. It is imprisoned, and its period of useful action in the current law is essentially non-existent. But its existence raises a question that the law has not fully answered. What happens when it wakes? C'tan shards can be destroyed. The Necrons broke the original C'tan into shards specifically so they could be imprisoned and eventually harvested for their power, without the full risk of engaging intact star gods. But destroyed is not the same as eliminated. The Void Dragon's essence, the specific character of what it is, would persist in some form, even through destruction, and a psychic entity of that magnitude being released into the warp would introduce a force into that dimension that has no interest in feeding the dark gods, no susceptibility to their influence, and a history of treating the Imperium as an enemy environment to be eliminated rather than a home to be expanded. There is also the question of what the Void Dragon represents to the forces of chaos as a piece of ancient history. The C'tan, before the Necron Rebellion, were in the process of implementing the plan to seal the warp from the material universe. The Void Dragon was among the most powerful of the star gods, and its specific domain, the mastery of technology, the understanding of physical laws, the ability to interface with and control mechanical systems, is exactly the expertise that would have been most useful in the construction and maintenance of a galactic-scale network of psychic suppression infrastructure. If the Necrons ever reached a point where they decided the pylon network needed to be completed at full scale, and the Star Gods' cooperation was necessary, the Void Dragon under Mars is technically available, if anyone was willing to pay the price of waking it. The Chaos Gods know this. The Martian surface has been the target of chaos infiltration efforts. The corruption of Mechanicus forge worlds, the seeding of dark-touched innovations into the sacred standard template constructs, yet the long and patient work of introducing chaos influence into the one place where it might eventually reach a sleeping entity that, if woken, would be the worst possible neighbor for a dark god trying to maintain influence over the material universe. The heresy's corruption of the Mechanicus, the creation of the Dark Mechanicum, the ongoing chaos interest in Martian forge world politics, all of this makes more sense as a long-term strategic effort to prevent the worst-case scenario the Void Dragon represents than as mere opportunistic corruption. There is one more quieter threat that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of all. The Toe are, by the standards of the major psychic players in the setting, essentially a non-entity. As their warp presence is minimal, the race evolved with almost no individual psychic capacity. Their emotional output barely registers against the background psychic noise of the galaxy. and for most of the setting's history, they have been essentially invisible to the forces of chaos in the way that very small fish are invisible to creatures that hunt by detecting blood in the water. The ruinous powers did not bother the toe during their expansion phase because there was nothing about the toe worth the effort of bothering, but the toe have been expanding for 6,000 years, and something has been accumulating in the warp during that time. Something that recent lore hints at under the name the fourth sphere of expansion's entity, a new warp presence that the toe encountered when their experimental FTL drive tore open a rift, and they were met by something that called itself a companion and wore the shape of their philosophical principles, the greater good, the collective ethical framework that 6,000 years of Tau cultural development had built, expressed back at them in the form of something that had come into existence in the warp as a result of their collective belief in it. The Tau's greater good entity is not a major power. It is young, small by the scale of the dark gods, and almost entirely undeveloped in the lore at this point. But its existence demonstrates a principle that the Chaos Gods cannot have missed. Even a species with almost no individual psychic presence can, if enough of them believe in something unified and consistent enough for long enough, generate a warp entity from that belief. The Toe, if they continue expanding and their population grows from hundreds of millions toward the trillions that humanity commands, will eventually be generating enough psychic output around the principle of the greater good to produce something in the warp of much greater significance. A warp entity born from a philosophy of collective welfare, mutual support, and reasoned cooperation is not likely to be friendly to the beings of chaos and division that currently dominate the Imperium. This is purely speculative territory, and I want to be clear about that. The Toe's future development as a psychic force is one of those lore threads that has been started but not yet followed anywhere definitive. But the direction it points is interesting because it suggests that the Chaos God's food supply problem is not just the Tyranids eating the galaxy from one end. It is also the gradual development of new psychic forces that, unlike the raw emotional static of most sapient life, are oriented around principles that do not feed the ruinous powers. A galaxy where more and more of the psychic output is organized around collective cooperation rather than individual fear, desire, despair, and bloodlust is a galaxy where the Chaos God's food gradually loses the nutritional components that sustain them. That is a very long game, longer than the Toe civilization has yet been running, longer than any current political actor in the setting can plan for. But the Chaos Gods do not think in terms of human political timescales, and neither do the Necrons, and neither does the Emperor on his throne. And the Tau, in their quiet corner of the galaxy, are writing the early chapters of a story that could, in principle, matter enormously when the later chapters arrive. Part 13. What the Chaos Gods actually fear. Drawing the threads together, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground, and I want to take a moment to do something that the lore itself rarely does explicitly. Step back and look at the pattern of what all these individual threats have in common, because there is a pattern, and it is not obvious until you have seen all the pieces. Every force that genuinely threatens the Chaos Gods does one or more of three things. It removes the food supply. It suppresses the environment the Dark Gods need to operate. Or it introduces a new principle into the warp that is constitutionally opposed to what the ruinous powers are. The Tyranids and the eventual heat death of biomatter removal. That is the first category, food supply elimination, at the extreme end of the spectrum. The Necron pylon network and the C'tan's original plan. That is the second category, environmental suppression, making the warp inaccessible to the material universe through direct engineering. The Emperor, Iniad, the greater good entity, and the Star Child. Those are the third category, new warp principles. It's beings whose very existence in the Immaterium occupies space that the Dark God's nature cannot easily tolerate, introducing something into the spiritual dimension that does not bend to the logic of chaos and corruption. The Orcs occupy their own category of threat that is less dramatic but no less fundamental. They represent a permanent, gigantic, structurally indigestible component of the galaxy's psychic output, a spiritual resource that the dark gods can see but cannot reach, channeled toward entities that the ruinous powers cannot subvert or absorb. And the great game is the meta-threat, the structural vulnerability that sits underneath all the others. The reason that even when the Chaos Gods perceive each of these individual threats clearly and understand what they represent, they cannot respond with sufficient coordination to address any of them decisively before the others have progressed further. The Chaos Gods are not stupid. They are not even limited in the way that mortals are limited, trapped in linear time and single perspectives. They can see the whole board in a way that no mortal strategist can approach, and they understand the implications of what they see. The urgency with which they acted against the Cadian pylons was not panic. It was calculated strategic necessity, the recognition that the window for preventing that specific threat from maturing into something decisive was closing. The corruption of Horus was not opportunism. It was a direct response to the Webway project's progress and the specific timeline it represented. But understanding a threat and being able to address it are not the same thing. The Chaos Gods face a fundamental limit that is built into their nature. They can influence and corrupt and destroy, but they cannot create. They cannot build a food supply that does not depend on sentient life generating the specific kinds of emotional output they need. They cannot design an alternative to the psychic environment that their existence requires. They cannot evolve past the emotional archetypes that define them, because those archetypes are what they are. A Chaos God that stopped being what it is would simply cease to be that Chaos God. The beings that threaten them, by contrast, are not similarly constrained. The Necrons can change their strategy, adapt their technology, but redirect their infrastructure toward new purposes as the situation develops. The Tyranids can evolve new adaptations against new threats. The Emperor, if the Starchild theory is correct, is in the process of becoming something genuinely new, something that could not have been predicted from what he was before. Iniad does not exist yet in its full form, and when it does, it will be a being that has never existed before in the Warp's history, with capabilities and a nature that none of the existing powers have had the opportunity to develop countermeasures against. The Chaos God's fear is the fear of beings who have been the apex predators in their environment for so long that they have forgotten how to evolve, facing a moment when the environment itself might be changing in ways that their static nature is not equipped to handle. That, which in the end, is the deepest truth at the heart of all of this. The Chaos Gods are gods of the old way. They are perfect expressions of certain fundamental principles of sapient existence, the endless hunger for more, the love of entropy and decay, the satisfaction of violence, the scheming pleasure of complexity for its own sake. These are real and permanent aspects of conscious life, and as long as conscious life exists, the Chaos Gods will be fed by it. In that sense, they are immortal in a way that is genuinely difficult to argue against. But the universe of Warhammer 40,000 keeps generating things that were not there before. A machine god waking from 60 million years of silence with a plan drawn from before the dark gods fully formed. A god being born from the spiritual treasury of a dying race's grief and hope combined. Was a fragment of compassion gathering itself in the warp around the residue of 10,000 years of prayer. The cold, biological certainty of a hunger that generates no psychic warmth. The galaxy is not simply waiting to be consumed. It is, in its slow and grinding and often horrifying way, fighting back. And the Chaos Gods, for all their power and all their ancient wisdom, are afraid of what might be growing in the dark spaces they cannot see into. They are afraid because they should be. Closing thoughts. The galaxy fights back. Pull back from the specifics. Look at the full picture. The Chaos Gods are ancient. They are vast. They are built from the collective psychic output of sentient life across a galaxy that has been suffering and striving and warring for tens of millions of years. They feed on what it means to be alive, and everything alive feeds them. By any reasonable measure of cosmic power, they should be winning. They should be winning decisively, in a way that leaves no room for hope or resistance, or the continuation of any force that dares oppose them. And yet, the Emperor sits on his throne, and his presence in the warp does not diminish with each century of decay but grows. Fed by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, grown strange and cold, and perhaps close to something no one has yet dared to fully anticipate, the Necrons wake from 60 million year sleep with a plan that predates the Chaos God's full formation, patiently rebuilding the infrastructure of a suppression network that the Dark Gods destroyed Cadia to prevent. The Tyranids advance from outside the galaxy, generating a living anti-warp silence that nothing in the ruinous power's entire toolkit can address. Hive Fleet Kronos closes warp rifts and cleanses corruption with the indifferent efficiency of a biological immune system, leaving behind zones of psychic silence in the regions where chaos felt most secure. Iliad stirs in the collective spiritual treasury of 10,000 years of Aeldari dead, building slowly toward the confrontation that Slaanesh knows at whatever level a god can know something, it cannot fully survive. The Orcs continue generating their enormous, indigestible, permanently inaccessible spiritual output in the direction of gods who are not the ruinous powers and never will be. The Starchild drifts in the Imperium, luminescent, accumulating, patient in the way that things becoming stars are patient. Yet the Chaos Gods are not invincible. They are extraordinarily powerful, and the war they are fighting is one where the odds genuinely favor them, and the setting would be dishonest if it pretended otherwise. The 41st Millennium is grimly dark for reasons that are real and structurally supported in the lore. The forces of order and life are outnumbered, under-coordinated, constantly beset from multiple directions simultaneously, and operating within a galaxy where the very spiritual dimension of reality has been actively hostile to their existence for tens of millions of years. But the specific shape of the Chaos Gods' vulnerabilities, the ways in which their power is derived from specific conditions that can be altered, as the ways in which their constitution as beings of single emotional archetypes prevents them from responding flexibly to threats that do not match their expected patterns, the ways in which their great game creates permanent structural weaknesses in any unified strategy, these are real limitations. And the forces that have stumbled into exploiting those limitations, or that have been deliberately designed to exploit them, or that simply exist as living contradictions of what the Dark Gods need to sustain themselves. These forces have done more to keep the lights on in the galaxy than any conventional military resistance could achieve. This, I think, is what makes Warhammer 40,000 genuinely interesting as a cosmological setting rather than simply a catalogue of horrors. It is not a story where the good guys are clearly going to win, because the balance of power is honestly tilted toward darkness in ways the setting never pretends otherwise. But it is also not a story where the Chaos Gods are simply immovable fixtures whose victory is inevitable if you just wait long enough. They are beings with specific natures and specific requirements, and the universe they inhabit has developed, entirely naturally, without any coordinating hand behind the process, multiple mechanisms that threaten those requirements simultaneously. The Emperor threatens to deny the Dark Gods humanity's psychic output. The Necrons threaten to suppress the psychic environment the Dark Gods need to operate. The Tyranids threaten to consume all the sentient life that feeds the gods. Iliad threatens to eliminate one of the 4 Dark Gods entirely, because the Orcs represent a permanent source of indigestible spiritual energy. The Great Game prevents any sustained unified response to any of these threats. And somewhere in the warp, a fragment of compassion and hope gathers itself around the memory of a man who once tried very hard to protect his species and paid a terrible price for coming close. None of this means that chaos will lose. The history of the setting strongly suggests that the most likely outcome of any given era is simply more war, more suffering, more of the grinding stasis that defines the 41st millennium and gives it its specific flavor of beauty. But the possibility of chaos genuinely losing, not just being temporarily repelled, but being reduced, limited, ultimately transformed into something less than what it is now, is not a fantasy imported from a gentler setting, but it is present in the lore's structure, encoded in every one of these threats, waiting for the combination of circumstances that would allow any of them to achieve what individually they seem capable of achieving. The Chaos Gods are afraid because they understand this. They have existed long enough and seen enough of the warp's patterns to know that the galaxy contains forces that can genuinely threaten them. And their fear, the urgency with which they moved to prevent the Webway project, to corrupt Horus, to destroy the Cadian pylons, to disrupt the Innery, to keep the Golden Throne failing but never quite failed. That fear is itself a kind of evidence. Not evidence that chaos will be defeated, but evidence that it can be, that the grim darkness of the far future is not quite as inevitable as it looks from within. Well, that is a strange kind of hope for a universe that takes pride in having none, but it is there, buried in the lore, waiting for those who know where to look. And now you know where to look. If you made it through all of that with me, thank you genuinely and deeply for the time you spent in this corner of the lore. The Chaos Gods are one of the richest elements of this setting precisely because the complexity underneath their surface presentation is so much more interesting than the surface itself. Understanding what threatens them tells you everything about what they actually are, and that understanding opens up the rest of the setting in ways that make even the most familiar pieces feel new. If this is the kind of deep exploration of the setting's lore and cosmology that you enjoy, is hitting the like button lets me know this is the direction worth going. And subscribing means you will catch every future video as it comes. There is genuinely so much more of this to explore. The 40,000 galaxy is vast and old, and full of these quietly world-shaking ideas, waiting to be properly unpacked. Leave your thoughts in the comments, especially if there is a threat to the Chaos Gods that you think deserved more attention here, or something in the lore that changes how you think about any of the forces we discussed today. The galaxy keeps fighting, so do we, because that is what this setting, at its most honest, is actually about. Not the grinding of civilizations into powder, not the triumph of darkness over light. Those are the surface conditions, the weather of the universe, the environment in which the real story happens. But the real story is about the specific and persistent refusal of certain things to go away. An old man on a broken throne who has not stopped thinking for 10,000 years. A machine race rebuilding ancient infrastructure with the patience of things that have already waited 60 million years and know how to wait some more. A species of brutal, joyful, impossible to corrupt warriors who fight because they love it and love nothing else and will never stop. A god assembling itself from the preserved grief of a dying people, patient as the dead always are. A shadow from outside the galaxy that eats everything, including the darkness that thought it owned the place. And somewhere, probably in the quiet between battles, in the moment before sleep or the moment after waking, yet in the private inner life that no enemy can ever fully access or corrupt. Individual human beings, individual Aeldari, individual members of every species across 1 million worlds, continuing to feel things, to hope, to love, to build things and believe they matter, not because the universe rewards that behavior or because any divine force has guaranteed its ultimate vindication, but simply because it is what they are. The Chaos Gods feed on feeling, yes, but feeling is not purely their territory. The same complexity of inner life that generates the despair Nurgle feeds on also generates the kind of love that has never had a god to speak for it in the warp. Not yet. But the same richness of human experience that gives Tzeentch its endless scheming material also produces those moments of perfect clarity when someone understands something true and acts on it cleanly and without complication. The same burning intensity that powers Horn's endless war also produces the specific courage of standing your ground when everything rational says to run. The Chaos Gods take the dark half of feeling and leave the light half behind, and the light half has been accumulating somewhere, 10,000 years of it, building something. That is the Warhammer 40,000 that I find genuinely beautiful underneath all its grim machinery, and that is what I wanted to share today. If you made it through all of that with me, And I genuinely mean this. Thank you. This kind of deep excavation of the lore is what I love doing most. And the fact that you are here at the end of something this long means you care about this universe in the same way I do. The Chaos Gods are one of the richest elements of this setting, precisely because the complexity underneath their surface presentation is so much more interesting than the surface itself. Understanding what threatens them tells you everything about what they actually are, and that understanding opens up the rest of the setting in ways that make even the most familiar pieces feel new. There is so much more to explore in exactly this vein. The Black Library's lore on Segorach, and the Laughing God's specific relationship with Chaos, a trickster deity who somehow survived in the warp while all other Eldari gods were consumed. Was the question of what the Harlequins actually know about the nature of reality that they are not sharing with anyone, the deeper mechanics of how the warp perceives time, and what that means for beings whose plans operate on million-year scales, the Perpetuals who are still alive in the current era, and what they have seen that nobody else living has seen. If those are the kinds of questions you want to sit with for an hour or two at a time, this channel is the place I bring them. Hitting the like button lets me know this direction is worth continuing, and subscribing means you will be there when the next one comes out. Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you think there is a threat to the Chaos Gods that deserved more time here, or if something we covered tonight changed how you see a part of the lore you thought you already understood. I read all of it, and the conversations that come out of these videos are some of the best discussions about this setting I get to have anywhere. The galaxy keeps fighting, so do we.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.